Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Open Graph talk. So people use timeline to tell the stories of their life, and Facebook is a platform for telling stories. And just a quick, kind of like a check. For those of you who were in the talk earlier today, how many actions are published on Facebook, Open Graph actions published on Facebook per day? All right, 1 billion. You're paying attention. Great. So the thing I want to talk to you about here is why would you use Open Graph and how you would use it. So with Open Graph, you can create semantically rich stories. And you as developers can actually let people tell stories of their lives through the apps that you create. And what I'm here to do is to show you how you can do that. So we're all a lot of developers here. Who's in favor of Keynote versus code? Keynote versus code. Keynote? Code. Code. Code wins. So we're going to go quickly through some slides here. And what we're going to cover here is an overview, first of all, just a really quick recap of what you learned earlier today. And since it should be fresh in your mind, I'll go through it really quickly. And once we go into that, the heart of the matter, we're going to start looking at code. How can you actually start building those Open Graph stories? And then we'll finish off with some pro tips, some of the things that you want to keep in the back of your mind as you are writing your code or developing Open Graph stories. So quick overview. As you said, we want to see more code. So you've seen this, better, best, good. Different ways of sharing from the iOS 6 share sheet to using some of the Facebook ShareDialog to actually using Open Graph to build semantically rich stories. And we encourage you to use Open Graph to build semantically rich stories. We also introduced action and objects as a way to tell stories with Facebook Open Graph. There's a class of objects or actions that are called common. So these are common things like the music that you read, the books, the music that you listen to, the books that you read. And these are common actions and objects. And we'll show you quickly how you can get started using that. So as a developer, straight out of the gate, you can use this to get familiar with Open Graph. And common actions and objects may not cut it for your story, for your app. They might be something that's unique to your app that you want to use. And I'll also show you how you can create custom stories to let users tell stories through your app. So one of the examples in terms of a custom story is Pinterest, which allows users to pin to a board. And we've seen this, Object API, great. I mean, I love this as a developer, not having to rely on standing up a web server. You can create objects programmatically, no server. All right, real quick, we wanted to get to code. We're going to start building a story. And the story we're going to tell is, I read a book. We've seen examples of that. We're going to dive into an app that allows you to create reading a book. And we're going to do this using the ShareDialog. We're also going to make use of the Object API to create an instance of the book. Now, being a little kind of cheating in the terms of this app, we're going to show you how you can create user-owned objects. Now, a book is not necessarily a user-owned object. It's something that can exist across the app. But we're just going to use it for demo purposes. We're going to show you how you can create instances of the objects, which represents a book, upload it to Facebook, and then share it using the ShareDialog. And the story that you create, I'm going to show you Objective-C code right now. So the first thing you do is you create an object, which defines what your book is. The second step you do is then you tie that object to an action. So you connect the read to the object. And then you actually do the publishing using the FB Dialogs class, the present ShareDialog with Open Graph action. So those are the 3 key steps that you need to do. With a few lines of code, you're able to use the ShareDialog to tell a story. All right, so got to the fun stuff. Let's switch to the demo machine, and we're going to start looking at code. So the first thing you obviously need to do is create a Facebook app. This is our Facebook app, Mobile DevCon New York. We've got all of the settings set up here, including the iOS settings. And then the key things, deep linking has also been turned on. Inside of your app dashboard, there's a section called Open Graph. This is where you will define any custom stories. And this is where any of the types that you defined are going to show up. We haven't created any stories, so it's blank. We also haven't created any story types, so that is also blank. So that's kind of where we're starting off with. And the story that we're going to be creating, as I said, is reading a book. So let me go ahead and show you the Xcode. So inside of Xcode, here's the story. I've set up actually a boilerplate code here. And I'll actually share the code on the group later on today. But it's just a UI view control UI with, where a user can flip and go through different kinds of books that they can then share with their friends. They can click on Share What You've Read. That's going to launch the dialogue. So let's go ahead and look at this running, just to kind of give you a sense. Here you got one book, the tipping point, and users can either log in or not logged in. Let's go ahead and see what happens. But first of all, I want to actually step through the code and see what's going on here. So when the user clicks on this button, share what you've read, they're going to invoke an action. So here's the view controller, and here's the section that actually gets invoked when the user clicks on the button. So let's go into it in a little bit detail here. Yes, yeah. Oops. Let's get out of that. And I'm going to go into the share action. So the share book action, this gets invoked. And the first thing is I create an instance of the FB Open Graph action. And this is a strongly typed representation of an action object in our Facebook Open Graph. And then I define what's the data here. So here's the book. Let's step through what are all of the details that are going on here. The type for a book in Open Graph is books.book. Then another key thing here is FB SDK create object. So this tells you that I'm actually creating an instance of the object. So I set that to yes. The rest is the title. The URL is pretty important here. If you're in a mobile-only environment, the URL might not exist because you're not standing up a web server. But where the URL is really important is if you're going to be handling links, deep links. So as the user sees the story, it links to your app. This is where the URL is important. Then we've also got an image description. And for the book's common object, there's a required ISBN number. So here we've set up the book. Then the next step here, pretty important, especially in this phase. As you know, the ShareDialog is in beta phase right now. So you actually have to turn this on. This is just temporary until we get it out of beta. Then the next step is where the share actually happens. So the FB dialog class is invoked, and then you're calling a method present ShareDialog with Open Graph action. You pass in the action. The action type is books.read, and then a property name for the preview. And then once you're done, inside of the handler, you can define a handler which handles the success or the error. And in this case, we're just going to be logging the success or the error in the console. So what happens is when the user clicks the button, it's going to go to Facebook. Facebook's going to present the ShareDialog, and when that's successful, it's going to come back to your app. When it comes back to your app, this handler is going to be called, but it's called only if you actually implement the FB app call. And you heard that earlier in talks. The FB app call handles incoming links. And here in the incoming link, you just basically set up the handler, call handle open URL method, and your handler should be invoked. So let's go ahead and run this. We actually have it running and see what it's going to look like. So I click on share what I've read. The share dialog comes up. You see the preview text saying Christine Abernathy read a book on Mobile DevCon New York. You also have the book name and the title and the caption. If you want to allow users to create a really rich, engaged story, with the share dialog here, it's easy to do that because we already have those controls built in there. And I can also say where I am. And then you have a story generated right there. Now, the key thing here is that with just a few lines of code, you're able to tell a story, a rich, engaging story, including your friends and a place, using the shared dialog. This was not possible before with the tools that we have. So I myself am really excited. In fact, the very first time I used the shared dialog, I actually had to commend the engineers. I sent them a message. It's so easy to use the shared dialog that I don't know what to do with my spare time. Because if you remember how it used to be, it was actually quite a pain. We were in a lot of hack events where we sat with people and showed them how to use this. This is much easier. So let's go ahead and post this. The story gets posted. You see a success logged in the console here. And then I have Facebook installed here. Now, the key thing here is if you're using ShareDialog, you need to have the latest version of Facebook installed. I have it installed in my simulator. Now, in your case, you're probably going to be running it on a device. We're aware of this issue, and we're looking into ways to make it easy so that you can actually exercise some of these features inside of the simulator. But for now, I have Facebook app installed. I'm going to go ahead and see the story that's posted just now. And the other key thing is if I actually click on this link, because I have deep linking enabled for my app, it's going to go and invoke my app. So I go ahead and click it. I actually put a breakpoint inside of this application so that you can go ahead and examine what is the information that comes back. So in this FB app call, you'll get information called app link data. And if you dig down deep in that, here you have something called target URL. So let's right-click and see what that looks like. Let's go ahead and highlight that. And the target URL is going to contain that URL that you used to create the object. And what you can do with this information is that you can then contextualize the experience so that if there are, for example, different books, I can look and see this is the tipping point book, or I can look and see if it's a different book and send the user to a more contextual experience. And it's very easy to do this with deep linking, as you've heard before. So that's step one, and we showed you how to quickly create a story, a rich, compelling story. The next thing I want to show you is how would you then, if you wanted to create a story, there's ways that if you notice the user was able to pick their friends. We also give you the ability to, for example, pre-select the friends or the place. You don't want to surprise the user when you're doing this, because you don't want to pre-select their friends unless the user has done it beforehand. But just wanted to give you the idea that it's very easy to do that using the Share Dialog. So let's go back to this code here. And we're just going to show you a piece of code that. So here is code here that I've just brought up. And in this code, when I set up the action and I attach, first of all, a book to it, I can also attach other information to it. I can set a place, and I can also tag friends. And if I do that and I run this once more, and then I click on the link, what's actually going to happen is that the user, the Share Dialog is going to have pre-selected. You see the text, the default preview text has changed. And I've actually selected a place and a friend that I'm performing this action with. So the key difference here is, since you are the app doing this, there's actually extra permissions that you need to ask for, extra capabilities that you need to get approval for. So let's go ahead and show you what you need to do that. So let's come back to this section. If you look now, this is my Open Graph section. It now has a few new object types that were created. So that very first time when I posted that read action, we automatically got an action type called read and a book. This was created automatically by Facebook. In addition to that, when the object was created, that book instance, we also got a post and an object action that were created. And these stories will actually show up on your activity log, but the post object is not going to show up on your timeline, but the read book is going to show up in your timeline, at least for the Share Dialog. But this just shows you how easy it is to kind of start going and setting up an Open Graph action. You didn't actually have to come to the app dashboard and set it up ahead of time, which you may have had to do if you are aware of using the old version, the previous versions of Open Graph. So the other key thing is, I mentioned that if you're going to be pre-selecting friends or a place, you're going to have to add capabilities. So this is the read action. This is where you can edit the read action. Because the read action is a common action, you've got properties here are baked in. You can't actually add anything more on the read action, but you can say that I want to, as part of my read action, have the ability to tag users or tag a place. If you don't do this and you try to post the action that I was just showing you, you're going to get an error. So it's something to keep in mind if you're going to be allowing users to pre-select friends or a place. All right. So let's skip and go to the next section. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is, what are you going to do if the user is using either a version of Facebook for iOS installed where the Share Dialog is not supported? Or there could be occasions where you want to create your own UI for sharing. So how would you go around doing that? Well, the key thing here is that we have provided for you all of these APIs that make it really easy to create objects. So you can actually create objects using the APIs and then use your own customized UI to get the information from the user and then share it using the APIs that we had previously for publishing actions. So we're going to go ahead and show you how you can do that. But before I do that, there's one thing I forgot to mention. If you're a developer and thinking about, say, I don't want a web server, you're kind of looking at this and saying, you ask me, do I have the option, instead of setting a URL for the image, to use one of the images that I have, for example, locally? So yes, you can. We're going to be adding the functionality to give you the ability to actually just specify, say, a UI image instead of actually specifying a URL. So that way, you're completely a mobile environment. But until then, for now, we do actually have a way that you can upload images to a staging server. And I'm going to show you how you can do that as part of the next call. So for now, you can use the URL or you can upload to our staging resources, or later on, when we're out of beta, we'll have fixed this. So let's go ahead and show you how you can then set things up so that you are now publishing using a native dialog. So here's an update of the code. And I'll just quickly walk you through the changes. Previously, in the code that we had, we set the book to a particular metadata, but now I've set it up slightly different. I have in this app, which I'll share with you later on, an array of different books that I'm going to be exercising different things. And here is the information that we had before the tipping point, but I have additional books just to exercise different use cases. And the use cases that we're going to be testing earlier on is whether or not, what would you do if you had an app-owned object, for example. The other thing that I've done in terms of changes in this new code base is we've added some extra checks in here. So previously, if you recall, we just called the FB dialog present dialog with the open graph action, but now we're processing the return. If the share dialog is presented successfully, you will get an object. If it's not presented successfully, this will return nil. So we're going to use the fact that a nil is returned, and we're going to invoke a customized UI. And inside of that customized UI, we're going to upload the object, and we're going to programmatically, through APIs, we're going to actually publish the action. And for that, we've actually created a new UI. So if the call is not successful, so if it's nil, and we're going to instantiate a new view controller that we're going to walk through. And in this new view controller, I've just defined an initialization function where I pass in the book's information for that particular book, and then I pass in some information related to what is the object type. In this case, it's books. And the reason I've done that, you'll see down the line, is to have the ability to pass different kinds of actions and objects. And I pass in an action type. And let's switch to this view controller, this MyShare view controller. First of all, I'm just going to look at the UI for that. So let's look at the nib file for this new view controller. It's a customized share UI, very similar to the share dialog, but not quite as nice. You have the cancel, you got your post, you got your user message, which is a text view, and you have a way to preview the object that you're going to be posting. In this particular customized share UI, there is no way to select friends or places. It's just a simple way to just show you the concept. So here, this is the UI, and let's look at the implementation for that share view controller. We've got a lot of logic around the UI and how you're handling it, but what I want to zero in on is the function that we're going to be using when the user clicks on that post button. So when the user clicks on the post button, if you are going to be publishing using the API, you must ask for publish actions permissions. When you were sharing using the share dialog, it went to the Facebook app, and then it basically authenticated you on that, and you didn't actually have to ask for any permissions because Facebook did that on your behalf. But now that you're actually going to be posting, you're going to have to ask for publish actions permissions. So that's the first thing you need to do, is request publish action permission. So here, when the user clicks on post action, we hide the keyboard, and then the key thing here is we're checking if we've got publish actions permissions. If we don't, we're going to be requesting it in a method that's just down here below. If we do have it, we're just going to call a method called publish story. And here is where you're requesting publish action permission. You just call the request new publish permissions. You pass in the default audience that you want, and then if it's successful, you're just calling the same publish story. So what is this publish story? This is where we're going to be actually creating the object and publishing the action. Let's go ahead and look at that. And initially, this is empty, and we're just going to walk through and add the code one by one. But quickly, what I'm going to be doing is the first step, we're going to have a batch request. We're going to batch 2 requests. The first request is going to upload the object, and the second request is going to take the results of the object upload, which should be an ID, and then it's going to attach it to the action and post the action. So let's start adding the code so that you have a sense of what it looks like. So here's the first thing. We're going to set up an FB request connection. And on this request connection, we're going to be adding an object. So here's the open graph object. So if you're going to be posting an object, we have new methods which allow you, say, open graph object for post. This sets up the object that you can use to create an instance. And at that point, you can then set up the object. Once you have this object, you can set up sort of the information about it, the type, the title. If there's an image, you can set the image, the description, and data. And then once you've got that, then you're now making the request to create the new object. So the request to create a new object, under the FB request, there is a new method in the 3.5 SDK called request for post open graph object, which in the handler, you can then specify in the handler whether or not there was an error. But what we're doing in this first batch request is we've got a batch name called object entry. We're going to use this batch name in the next section where we have a second request. So let's go ahead and drop more code in here. So here we're setting up the action. So here we're going to be tying an action to a book. So similar to what you did with the ShareDialog, you're going to create an action, which is an FB Open Graph action. And the first thing you do here is we're finding the result from the previous batch call. And then we're setting it to the action. So in this case, think of it as action books and the ID that came back from the first call. And then as part of that call, we're also going to be adding, as part of the action, we're going to be attaching, if the user enters a message, we're going to be attaching the message there. And the other thing, the really key thing here is FB explicitly shared. We're setting that to true for this action. Since the user has intentionally hit the share button, you can set this to true. If anything kind of implicit sharing is going on, you do not want to set this for true. If you're using these capabilities, you definitely want to go ahead and ask for those capabilities. If you do not, it will cause an error. So we're going to pause real quick and go ahead and ask for these capabilities in the read action. Explicitly shared and user messages. And the other thing is, because you ask for these capabilities, if you eventually want to have your app live, you're going to go through an approval process, submit your read action for approval, and then you'll be able to, or users will be able to use it. So let's go back to the code and continue. We've set up the books, we've set up the actions. Now I need to just make that second request. And here's the second request, the publish action request. How many of you have used Open Graph before? Quite a bit. So you kind of know the concept. If you're using with iOS, it's a graph path to the the app name, or like books.read. And then you're publishing and you're passing in an object. This is pretty much that same step, but what you're passing in here, instead of a URL, is an ID that you get from the first call. So that's what's happening right here. So it's just a request for post with graph path, what the action type is going to be books.read in this example. And we're passing in the action. This is what we constructed before, where we added the message, explicitly shared, and the ID. And then in this request, in the completion handler, if everything goes well, we should have an ID published. So that's how you would publish using just APIs, not using the ShareDialog. The way I've set this up is this native UI that I created is going to be invoked if the ShareDialog is not supported. So I'm going to actually run this in a different simulator where I do not have the Facebook for iOS app installed. So once I run this, it should come up real quick. And the other thing that I don't know if you noticed, but when I ran all the samples before, at no point did I log into Facebook. So with the ShareDialog, you don't necessarily have to log in with Facebook. But in this case, because I'm going to be publishing using the APIs, I'm going to need to log into Facebook. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I've already set up the iOS 6 system account. Now that I'm logged in, I can go ahead and share. So this is not your nice little share sheet, but so I go ahead and post that. And here you see, now I know that I'm actually sharing for the very first time. The permissions are being asked in context. I go ahead and share this. And here you see a posted OG action show there. So it completed successfully. I didn't have to stand up a web server. Let's go ahead real quick and check what the story should look like. So here are all of the stories that are related to my app. So this story just posted right now. I read the tipping point. And here I mentioned that when you create a new object, you'll see a story in your activity log called posted. So this is where the object is created. All right, so this is how you would use, and this is what you would use if you wanted to post an action. I also want to quickly tell you about how you could, instead of using the URL for an image, how you could upload an image. So let's go ahead and show you that. in the same code. So what's been added is an extra piece of code here. Let's go ahead and show you. So previously, we would set the image for the object, but what if the book didn't have an image attached to it? I've actually set up the code with one of my books that I'm demoing doesn't have an image URL, and I've set up the code that if there is no image URL attached to it, I'm going to take the locally stored image and upload it, just to show you how that could be done. So we have a new function here called publish image that we've set up, and what this publish image is going to do is upload the image into the staging resources server, and then after that image is uploaded, we're going to get back a URI. We're going to attach that URI and make that the image for the object. So let's go ahead and show you what that code looks like. So here's the key code. We have another new helper method on the FB request connection called start for upload staging resources with the image. You pass in the UI image, and in the completion handler, if successful, you're going to get a result with a URI back. And this URI is not something you can put in a web browser and look at, but it's something that you can then attach to the object and make that part of the URL. You can definitely use the same URI if you're attaching it to the action. In this case, we're attaching it to the object. And so once we've set up the object and everything looks good, we're going to publish the story. So as you see, pretty easy to actually upload an image. And as I told you earlier, if you're using the Share Dialog, today you have to pass in a URL. So you can use the same functionality, use the image sources URL, get the URI, and attach it to the URL. And that's a temporary hack that you can do for now. But that's how you would upload image resources and get it working. OK. So we've been talking a lot about user-owned objects. And this example is kind of a little, like I said before, a little off, because books are not something that's really private or user-owned, but it's just to illustrate the point. And in the next point, I'm just going to talk about app-owned objects. So let's go ahead and show you some what that would look like. And to do that, let me just go back into this view controller. And I have a couple of what I call app-owned objects that have been defined here. And I've defined them by two ways. One is by an ID, and one is by a URL. And the URL is what everybody who has been developing with Open Graph knows, that you had to attach a URL to an object, something that had to be visible externally. We've made available an object browser. And in the object browser, which you see here, this is where all of the objects, whether they're app-owned or user-owned, are going to be going to show up. So here in my app, I've selected it. And if I select owner, I could either have an owner, which is the app, or me. These are the objects that I just showed you for the two ones that I created. This one corresponds to the Catching Fire book. I could actually create a new object here for a new book that I could set up and then use later. But we already pre-set up a book, and that ID is what we're using inside of the app. You can go ahead and modify any of the information that you want here. You can't modify the ID, but you can modify some of the properties if you made a mistake. We also have URLs that we also have objects that come from the traditional way of implementing with Open Graph, and these are represented by these URLs. These, you cannot really edit the properties because they come from your web server. So in this case, I actually have a URL that I have here, and anybody who's integrated with Open Graph will recognize that you had to stand up the OG and put all these objects in this URL. They should be very familiar to you. Whether you're using the Share Dialog, you can actually still use these URLs. So all the work and effort that you've gone so far is not gone to waste. If you still want to use the URLs, you can go ahead and do that. And we're going to show you how you can do that. As I mentioned, inside of the code, I've got two example books, one for Catching Fire and one which is just a URL. And let's go ahead and show you how those will be published. And I'm going to switch back to the simulator that I know has the Facebook for iOS installed, so that I can go ahead and show you what that would look like. OK, so while that's compiling, and the other key thing that I wanted to highlight as that's showing up is all of the objects that you created are also visible, like the, let's go ahead and look at this. So if I wanted to look at some of my user-owned objects, those are available here. So these are the two that I just created earlier today from the two shares that I did. one when I use the share dialog, and one when I use sort of my own customized UI. So let's go ahead and check a few books out. Catching Fire. This is the one that was created previously. This is an app-owned object that was created using the object browser. So when it's sharing, it's actually passing the ID as part of the share. So here, you go ahead and say, can't wait for the movie. And I can go ahead and post that or add friends. And pretty much the same sharing experience. If we were to look at the code here, and we're just going to jump to the same ShareAction code. Here, if we follow the code here, Action Book is going to have information. It's just going to basically be the ID. In the case of the other example, the example of the fourth book, 6 Years by Harlan Coben, this is signified by URL. Same thing. You can go ahead and post the story. It works. So it works with the object that you create on the fly. It works with the objects that are based on ID, and it also works with URLs. And this is a pretty neat thing if you're a mobile developer. We've basically covered all bases. And let's go ahead and see what the story looks like. I want to highlight a few things here. So the two stories that I just published, one was Reading 6 Years, one was Catching Fire. If you notice, these are just reads. There was no post attached to this. You don't see a post activity log, only because these were objects that were already created. Excuse me. But for previous ones, we had the post show up. Okay. So for the previous objects, we had to post them, so we had to create the objects before we set it. Grab some water, something. All right. So we've now shown you how you can create custom stories. And we've now showed you how you can create using, we've showed you how you can create stories using these common actions and objects to share your stories. I want to switch back to the slides, please. All right. Oh, water from two sides. Great service. Thanks you. Okay. Actually, can we switch back to the demo machine? I just forgot one more thing. So earlier today in the keynote, somebody asked a question. Somebody said, we've got these object API. These are graph API calls. What if we wanted to use Android? How would we do that? I actually posed this question to Jesse Chan, who's one of the engineers on the support group here. And in about 10 minutes, he just built this. So pretty awesome. Where are you, Jesse? Is he here? Hey, Jesse. So this just quickly shows you how you could use the calls, API calls, in Android to set this up. So here we have a method called OG user-owned action. And what this is doing is it's doing a couple of things. It's using the graph API calls to create an object. Once it's created that object, it's just going to post an action. So the object it's creating, it's a book. Let's start from the bottom. So the first thing it's doing is it's puts together a JSON object which represents a book. So you got your title, your image, your URL, your ISBN, which is your required data. It puts it in an object, in a JSON object, and then it sends a request. It sends a request to me/objects/books.book. And that's how you would create it. So with the Android SDK today, we don't have a lot of helper methods that are wrapped in iOS, but you can certainly use something like this. Once this request has been executed, we've defined a callback. And this callback is up here. And inside of this callback, we're checking the response that we get back from the server. We're expecting an ID back. Once we get this ID, we're going to use this ID to attach the books.read to this ID, the book action. So here, we set up a bundle. We pass in the book, pass in the object ID that we got from the results call, and then we make a request call. So here's the request that actually publishes the action. It calls the me/books.read, it posts the action, and it passes in the params to, which happens to be the book and the ID. And then once that has been successfully, inside of this callback handling, we're just going to basically say, this is what we got in terms of the book object, which we got from a previous call, as well as the action ID. So that's how you'd actually use the object API to create, inside of Android, to tell your story. So let's switch back to slides. Back to slides, please. So the other thing that we heard from Rose earlier today is that you actually have access to collections. So any of the actions, any of the stories that you create using common actions and objects, you're able to have users added to their collections. So for example, if I already had Goodreads and I had a book collection, the app that I just created, I could add those books to that collection as a user, and then just build up my identity. And this is what the mobile experience would look like. It's not available, but it's coming soon. So users will be able to, on their mobile experience, see some of the collections. This is the music. So what if you don't want to just use these actions and objects, and you want to tell a custom story, something that's unique to your app and to your users, where the books and the reads and the listens are not good enough for you? You can certainly do this with Facebook. In fact, a lot of the things that I've already showed you are pretty easy to do, and you only have to do a few configuration steps in the beginning. So the story that we're going to create is like, a custom story saying I created a challenge. Summertime is coming, maybe you're going to be creating a fitness challenge. So this is an example of a story that could be created. So if you're going to be creating a story, there's a few things that you would need to do. You would need to model your data. What is it that is unique to your app that users do? Then you need to set up a custom story. Inside of the app dashboard, you can go and set up a custom story, the actions and the objects that tell the story in your app. Then you can then create test objects or go ahead and skew them up in your app. And there's various ways you can do this using, say, the object browser. You can then publish test actions, and you can do this in various forms. You can use the Graph API Explorer. A lot of you have experience using the app, so that, as we said, is a great place that we can create test actions. And then hook it up in your app, and then once everything's good to go, just make sure, since it's a custom action, to submit it for approval. So let's go ahead and switch back to the demo machine. So the first step we're going to do is we're going to create a new story. And we're going to create a story which says that the user created a challenge. So here inside of the app dashboard, let's go ahead and click Create. And then a challenge. And just like that, we've created a story. And once you've created the story, then you can go ahead and change some of the sentences that get generated by default. Here is where you can configure, for example, if it's not quite right, but we tend to do our best job of getting it right. And here inside of the types, a couple of new types are going to show up, one for the challenge under the object and one for the create. And just as an example, under the create action, you can then add extra properties, anything that's unique to your particular action, and you can do the same thing for the challenge object. So and then you can also add capabilities for your app. So this is the configuration that you need to do up front. The rest of what I'm going to show you is going to look very familiar from what you needed to do to use the Share Dialog to publish a custom story. So I'm going to go back, and inside of this UI, what we've added is we've added an extra button. So we're going to create a challenge in the context of book reading, so maybe like a summer reading challenge. And let's just go ahead and show you what the code's going to look like. So we're going to expose a new button that's going to show up in the UI. And this new button is going to allow users to say that they created a challenge reading, a summer reading challenge. And let's go ahead and build that and run it. So other than actually showcasing the button, there's a few other things that we added. So let's go ahead and stop it. So a new button will get created for creating a challenge. So creating a reading challenge, and when that button is clicked, let's go ahead and see what's going to show up here. So we have a new action, create challenge action here. This is going to start to look very familiar to you. We define an object that represents that challenge. We're going to be uploading a new instance, create object yes. The type here is important. The type represents what is the challenge, what is the object. So it's usually your app namespace, colon, and then your object type. The title, summer reading challenge, we've got a URL that we can use for deep linking purposes. The image, everything else should be very similar from the example for common object. Again, the rest should be very familiar by now. You create an FB Open Graph action, attach it to and then attach a challenge object to that action, then make a call. And here another key difference is inside of the action type instead of being books.read is your action type colon and then your app namespace colon your action type name. And very much the same thing you did before. If you wanted to handle any fallbacks, we've got it set up in the code to do so. So if we now display this and click on it, here you got your preview text saying I created a challenge. I can go ahead and post this. A story is going to get posted on my timeline if I wanted to look at it. So it created a challenge on Mobile DevCon just now. So very easy, very, very easy to use this with custom stories. As you can see, it literally took me not a long time to actually set this up and get it going. So let's switch back to slides, please. So once you create all these custom stories, the other thing you can do is you can then create these custom collections that users can use and add to their timeline. And it's something that makes sense for your app. For example, it could be in this example app that we have, all of the books that I've read. So I may want to create all of the books that I've read. You can definitely do this by, first of all, if you go to your app dashboard, there's a place there where you can go ahead and check. Actually, let's go ahead and show you that. We've got a little bit of time. So could we switch back to the demo machine? I'm going to show you real quickly how you could create a custom collection. So inside of my app dashboard, there's a section here for collections. When I click on that, I can create a new collection. And I can choose what is the action type, what are the available collections, like sort of like the top challenges or the recently created challenges. And once I click on create, it's going to show up here. I have the ability to choose what is the layout style that I'm looking for, and then what data that I need to display. I'm just going to accept the default. And then once that's done, I have a new custom collection that is available here. When you create a custom collection, you definitely need to have it submitted to approval before it can be used. And then once that collection has been created, then I can go to my button. Oh, OK. All right, and that's where I created. So let's go back to we're running out of time. So let's go back to our slides and finishing up. I just want to go through some quick pro tips that you need to think. And Prashant talked about the empty room problem. With the Object API, you are actually able to read objects. So we've created a really easy way to read all the objects. These are app-owned objects, and you definitely want to go ahead and use the Object Read API to read objects and avoid the empty room problem. The other thing is, if you're using the Object API, there's some URLs that get created that you can use. If you're a native-only developer, you might be tempted to just use some random URLs, but you just want to future-proof your URL so that in the future, if you kind of expand to a mobile environment, that you're not going to be ending up in a scenario where users click on a link, which works on native, but when they click on it, it goes to a URL that doesn't exist. So future-proof your URL so it goes to domains and URLs that you use. The third thing I want to talk about is explicit sharing. If you're having users share, you want to give them an opportunity to be able to turn off the sharing and make it very obvious that they're sharing to Facebook. And lastly, with implicit sharing, you want to give users an ability to know, first of all, that you are sharing the information, and then have the ability to easily turn that off. So have users feel like they're in control. So quickly, this is what we talked about. We went through the overview, we created a story, and we gave you some quick pro tips, things to think about. Some key takeaways just to wrap it up. Facebook platform helps users tell the stories, and you can help them do that to the apps that you create. It's easy, really easy for mobile developers to do this using the ShareDialog. And the Object API allows you, again, to make this whole mobile implementation easy. You can also create custom stories that are unique to your app using the features that we've used. And we have with the ability with ShareDialog to easily enrich stories, and you can build that in yourself if you want to. And one of the big pro tips is to give users the feeling of control when they're sharing with your app. So as I said, Facebook is a platform for telling stories. And I'm really excited to see what you guys are going to build with some of the awesome features that we've made available for you today. So thank you so much for your time.